Have you ever imagined being alone in the bitter cold of the forest, with no one to help? Without food, without shelter, without hope? Now imagine that this doesn't happen to a human, but to a defenseless bear cub, hungry and on the verge of collapse. He has nowhere to go. There is no one to protect him. He only has one last option: beg for help. But would anyone hear his cry for help? What would you do if you were faced with a wild animal in despair? A thin, trembling bear cub, dragging its paws through the freezing snow, its eyes pleading for a miracle. This isn't just another animal rescue story. It's a journey of survival, a moment where nature puts a test before a man, and what he does next changes everything. That night in the darkness of the forest, hunger spoke louder than fear. The little bear approached an isolated cabin, his paws sinking into the snow as each step became more difficult. The wind howled through the trees, the cold was merciless, and fate seemed sealed. Until something unexpected happened. You won't believe what this little bear did to survive. This story has an outcome that no one could predict, and that will leave you speechless. But before we reveal this exciting moment, tell me, have you ever witnessed something as moving as this? How would you react if you found a wild animal begging for help? Leave your comment now and stay until the end, because this story will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. The sharp wind blew mercilessly, passing through the twisted trees of the icy forest, carrying with it a gloomy silence. The white immensity of Alaska stretched out on all sides, with no signs of life, just the echo of the wind and the rustle of dry, frozen leaves. The temperature dropped to 35 degrees C, making every breath a challenge, every movement an effort. In the midst of this hostile landscape, a small grizzly bear cub stumbled through the deep snow, leaving faint footprints that were soon erased by the merciless wind. He was alone, lost, hungry. Its paws trembled with each step, its nose immersed in the ice as it tried to sniff out some trace of food. But there was nothing. The cold consumed his energy, and hunger eroded his strength. His fur, already thin to face such low temperatures, was damp, hardened by the ice. He was breathing hard, small grunts escaping him as he tried to stay upright. His mother should have been there, but it wasn't. What had happened? What made this puppy face such a cruel world so early without any protection? He didn't know. I just felt the emptiness of absence, the constant fear and the desperate need to survive. In the distance, a faint light flickered between the trees. A lonely cabin hidden in the vastness of the forest, a human shelter in the middle of nowhere. The little bear felt a ray of hope. Something inside him, perhaps an ancestral instinct, made him move towards that light even without knowing what he would find. His paws sank into the snow, his body wavered with weakness, but he didn't give up. Each step was a challenge against nature itself, a battle between his fragility and the hostile environment that surrounded him. Inside the cabin, Nolan. He adjusted the fireplace, watching the flames dance as he held a hot cup in his hands. He had lived there for years, an experienced ranger accustomed to the challenges of Alaska. But nothing prepared him for the scene he saw when he looked out the small, ice-covered window. His eyes fixed on something moving among the shadows. At first, he thought it was a fallen log covered in snow, but then he noticed the small footprints, the trembling body, the lost gaze. A bear cub, alone. In mind of Nolan started working quickly. It was extremely rare to see such a young bear cub away from its mother. Typically, they were in her care for up to 2 years. If he was alone there, something terrible had happened. His heart sank as he imagined the possibilities. Had the mother been shot by hunters? Had it been swept away by a storm? Had she been chased away by a male bear? Nolan took a deep breath. I knew I shouldn't interfere. Wildlife rules. The rangers always repeated the same mantra. Don't feed wild animals. Don't interfere with nature. But how could he ignore that? How could I just close my eyes and pretend I didn't see? Outside, the cub was staggering, its small eyes fixed on the light of the cabin. He begged, even without words. His body spoke for him. Every shaky movement, every tired gasp, every failed attempt to hold on to the snow. He was on edge, and Nolan knew that. What would he do? Would you open the door and help? Or would he follow the cold rules of survival and let the little bear face his fate alone? This decision could change everything. Now I ask you, what would you do? If you were in the place of Nolan, could you close your eyes and ignore that puppy's cry for help? Or would she risk everything to save him? What would you do in this situation? Leave your opinion in the comments. I will read each one of them. The wind was still sharp, whistling through the twisted trees as if the entire forest was whispering a warning. Snow was accumulating quickly around the small cabin, covering the ground in a thick, treacherous layer. Outside, the bear cub continued his silent fight against death. His steps were increasingly shaky, and his body could barely support its own weight. He panted. His small chest rose and fell irregularly. Each breath was an immense effort. The cold was cruel, sapping his strength with each passing second. Nolan and I watched everything through the window, feeling a tightness in my chest. He had seen many difficult moments in the wild, but this was different. There was something in that pleading look, in that desperate weakness that made him feel an immense responsibility. He knew that feeding a wild bear was a mistake. It could interfere with the animal's natural instinct, make it dependent on humans, change its behavior, and put it at risk in the future. But at the same time, how could he just close the curtain and ignore that puppy? That was he fighting his own extinction before his eyes. Outside, the little bear took another hesitant step, but his paws gave way, and he fell face down in the snow. He stood there for a moment, motionless. His chest was still moving slowly, but the weight of cold and hunger were winning. Nolan clenched his fist. He knew that if he waited a few more minutes, there might be no further decision to be made. It was then that a howl echoed through the forest. Far away, distant, scary, a call that made the blood run cold. Nolan froze for a moment. Lobos. Wolves rarely attacked adult bears, but a defenseless cub was a completely different story. That sound was not just a solitary howl, it was a warning. The predators were close and they knew there was easy prey there. The heart of Nolan went off. He looked back at the cub who was now lifting his head with difficulty, his small ears moving as he picked up the sound. He also felt the danger. Nature was ruthless and the weak had no place to hide. The strong wind shook the cabin door, creaking on its hinges, as if fate itself was forcing Nolan to act. Time was running out. He could see the snowflakes dancing in the air, being carried away by the gale as the darkness of the night closed in around them. Every minute that passed made the cub's survival even more unlikely. Nolan. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the conflict within himself. He knew he had to let nature take its course, that bears were strong, that this cub could find his own way. But then, something inside him screamed louder than logic, stronger than the rules he had learned. He couldn't stay still. In one swift movement, he opened the door. The icy air hit his face like a sharp blade, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. But then, his eyes met the cub's once again, and it was at that moment that he knew. He had made his decision. Stepping forward, he grabbed a piece of dried meat he kept for emergencies and threw it towards the little bear. The food fell into the snow, and for a moment, the cub didn't move. But then, the smell hit him. His eyes lit up with a mixture of hunger and hope. With tremendous effort, he crawled to the food and, with visible tremors, began to eat. Nolan, he felt momentary relief. But that didn't solve everything. He knew that just one piece of meat would not be enough. The cub needed warmth, needed shelter, and he still needed to decide how far he was willing to go. Another howl cut through the air, this time closer. Nolan closed his eyes for a second. If he didn't do something now, the next thing he would hear would be the sound of wolves attacking. And this was a scene he would never forget. Now I ask you, what would you do? Would you risk everything to save this little creature? Or would you follow the rules and let nature decide its fate? Comment below and tell me your opinion. And if you want to know what happened next, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This story isn't over yet. And I guarantee you what comes next will surprise you. The cabin door creaked slightly as he opened it. The cold air invading the small space warmed by the fireplace. The biting wind was blowing harder now, sending small swirls of snow across the wooden floor. Outside, the bear cub remained motionless, his fur already covered by a thin layer of ice, his eyes tired and glassy, but still fixed on the figure of the man who was now slowly advancing towards him. Nolan. He held a piece of dried meat in one hand, feeling the weight of the moment on his shoulders. He knew it could change everything. He knew he was crossing an invisible line between right and wrong, between respecting nature and intervening in it. But how could he just ignore that look? How could I turn my back on a living being that, at that moment, only needed a single gesture of compassion to have a chance of surviving? The cub shivered when Nolan got a little closer. His body instinctively shrank as if ready to flee, but he did not flee. He just stood there, muscles tense, watching the human's every movement. Nolan. He slowly lowered himself, keeping his eyes fixed on the little bear, trying to convey security, trying to show that he was not a threat. The hand outstretched with the dried meat trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the tension of the moment. The cub sniffed the air, smelling the food, and for a moment his instincts seemed to wage battle within him. The fear was still there, but the hunger was louder. There was a second of hesitation, an instant of uncertainty, but then he stepped forward. Small, shaky, but decisive. His brown eyes met those of Nolan, and for the first time, something changed. He wasn't just a hungry bear. He wasn't just a wild animal trying to survive the relentless cold. At that moment, he was a desperate life, a fragile existence fighting against the forces of nature. And Nolan, he realized that he wouldn't be able to, leave him there to die. The little bear advanced a little further, still hesitant, but determined. His icy snout touched the tips of his fingers. Nolan, for a brief moment before picking up the meat and quickly stepping back, chewing hard, as if he feared that piece of food would disappear before he could swallow. Nolan. He stood still, watching. His heart was beating hard in his chest, not because of fear, but because of the emotion of that moment. He had made contact. He had established a bond, however fragile, however tenuous. The background music intensifies at this moment, a melody full of emotion, bringing even more impact to what is happening before the viewer's eyes. Because this isn't just a scene of a man feeding a bear. This is the pure representation of the survival instinct, the connection between species, the compassion that transcends the barriers between humans and animals. The cub finished the meat quickly and licked his dry lips, as if he wanted more but wasn't yet sure if it was safe to get close again. He raised his head, looking at Nolan, as if waiting for his next move. And Nolan. I knew, at that moment, that he couldn't just close the door and pretend nothing happened. He couldn't ignore the fact that now, that little creature gave him the only hope he had of staying alive. But what about you? What would you do if you were in your shoes? Nolan? Would you have the courage to open the door and reach out to help, knowing that it could change everything? Or would you let nature take its course even if it meant watching that cub succumb to cold and hunger? Tell me here in the comments. I want to know your opinion. And if you want to know what happened after that unbelievable moment, subscribe to the channel right now and activate the bell, because this story is far from over. What happens next will surprise you. The night was advancing quickly, and the cold seemed more and more merciless. The biting wind roared through the trees, whistling as if the forest itself were telling dark secrets. Heavy clouds covered the moon, casting a deep darkness over the white landscape. Nolan, he felt a shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was from the scene before his eyes. The little bear, who just moments ago was struggling to stay upright, was now shaking violently, his legs wobbling with each attempt to take a step. His body, already too thin for a puppy his age, was curled up, trying to somehow protect himself from the relentless cold that punished his fragile body. Nolan. He held the door ajar, not knowing what to do. His instincts screamed to act, to rescue that little being who clearly couldn't last much longer out there. But his mind said otherwise. Taking a bear into the cabin could be a mistake. It was a wild, unpredictable animal, and more than that, it could be dangerous for both of them. If the puppy recovered and panicked in the enclosed space, it could become aggressive. Nolan and I had dealt with bears before, and I knew that, even when young, they possessed considerable strength. He closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply, trying to think clearly, but then something made his heart race. The cub let out a small whimper, almost a whisper, before its paws gave out completely. His body fell onto the hut's porch, falling onto the cold wood without the strength to get up. He didn't try to move anymore. His eyes were half closed, his breathing weak and uneven. The cold was winning. Hunger was winning. Nolan, he felt a lump in his throat. If I don't do something now, he might not survive until dawn. The idea of simply closing the door and ignoring that life about to disappear was unbearable. He would never forgive himself. But what to do? The risk of taking the cub inside was real, and he couldn't just ignore it. It was a dilemma between logic and heart, between reason and the instinct to help. Outside, the storm seemed to gain even more strength, as if the universe itself was testing his resolve. The snow was already beginning to accumulate on the cub's small, inert body, covering its ice-stiffened fur. With every second that passed, time was running against him. Nolan. He looked around, his brain trying to find alternatives. Could he try to warm him up another way, leave it in a sheltered corner of the balcony, away from direct wind? But no, it wouldn't be enough. The temperature was dropping too fast. The cub was already too weak. If he stayed there, it would only be a matter of minutes before his breathing became even slower, until it stopped altogether. Lan. He felt his chest tighten. He no longer had a choice. With a single decisive movement, he stepped outside and knelt down beside the cub. The touch of the icy fur beneath his hands sent a shiver through his body. The little bear was completely still. His breathing was so weak that movement in his chest could barely be seen. He slid his hands carefully under the animal's body, feeling how thin it was, the skin almost glued to the bones. This made his heart break even more. How could anyone ignore such a helpless being? How could nature be so cruel? With a controlled effort, he lifted the cub into his arms, feeling its weight too light for a bear its age. It was like holding a bag of bones covered in fur and snow. Nolan. He hesitated for a moment, the dilemma still weighing on his mind. But then, he felt a small, warm sigh against his jacket, as if the cub was using the last of his strength to trust him. And that's when he knew. He couldn't go back. He turned quickly and entered the cabin, closing the door with a firm movement. The sound of the wind was immediately muffled, and the heat from the fireplace seemed even more intense after the freezing weather outside. He walked to a far corner, where there was a small area lined with blankets, and carefully placed the cub there. The small body did not react. His breathing was still shallow, but at least he was no longer exposed to the murderous night wind outside. Nolan, she knelt beside him, observing every detail. The little bear remained motionless, his breathing short and shaky, his eyes closed. The heat of the cabin would take time to take effect, and the fear was now different. Could it be that he was already too weak? Did he act too late? The tension was overwhelming. Silence weighed heavily on the environment, only interrupted by the crackle of wood burning in the fireplace. Nolan. He knew he had made the most difficult choice of his life. Now all that was left was to wait. But the question that wouldn't come out of his head was, had he made the right decision? Or had I made a potentially costly mistake? And you? In place of Nolan, would you have done the same? Or would the fear of consequences speak louder? Tell me in the comments. I want to know your opinion about this difficult decision. And if you want to know what happened next, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because this story is still far from over, and what comes next will leave you breathless. The silence inside the cabin was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside and the crackling of the flames in the fireplace. The heat gently danced through the room, contrasting with the relentless cold that Nolan felt when rescuing the puppy. Now he held it firmly, but with extreme care, as if any sudden movement could break it. The little bear didn't react. His body seemed so fragile, so light. It was as if it had been hollowed out by hunger and cold, reduced to almost nothing but bones and shaggy fur, hardened by accumulated ice. Nolan. He felt his own heart beating loudly in his chest like a drum echoing in the darkness of the night. He looked around, trying to quickly find a safe place to put the cub. He needed warmth, needed immediate refuge. His mind worked fast. He couldn't just lay him on the floor, where the cold was still seeping through the cracks in the wood. In one agile movement, he knelt next to a corner of the cabin where he kept some bales of hay. Normally, he used it to better insulate the floor and prevent the cold from rising through his feet. But now, that simple material could mean the little bear's only chance of survival. He spread the hay quickly, creating a kind of makeshift bed, and then grabbed some blankets he kept stored for colder nights. He turned his attention to the cub. His chest still rose and fell, but so subtly that he had to hold his breath for a second to make sure he was still alive. The small body was stiff, weak tremors ran through its muscles, a reflection of the fight it was fighting against freezing. With all due care, he laid the cub down on the hay, adjusting the blankets around him. The heat from the fireplace should start to take effect soon, but he knew that alone wouldn't be enough. The little one was on the verge of hypothermia. Nolan hesitated. What else could you do? Then, almost instinctively, he got up and grabbed a thermos that he usually used to keep his water warm at night. He filled it with warm water from the pan on the fire and wrapped the container with a cloth before placing it gently next to the cub's body. He needed to raise the temperature gradually, without thermal shock, or it could make the situation worse. The next few minutes were suffocatingly tense. He sat next to the little bear, watching him closely, not daring to take his eyes off him. Time seemed to drag by. Every second felt like an eternity. Outside, the wind continued to roar. The storm hit the forest, but inside, in that small space of heat and light, there was a silent battle for life going on. Then it happened. The first movement. It was almost imperceptible, but it saw. A small tremor ran through the cub's body. Then a deeper sigh, a sign that his lungs were beginning to react to the warmer environment. Nolan held his breath. And then, as if awakening from a deep and dangerous sleep, the cub slowly opened its eyes. The small, dark eyes were cloudy, lost, as if they still didn't understand where they were. For a moment, she thought he might panic, that he might get up suddenly and try to run away. But no, he just looked around, blinking slowly, taking in his surroundings. He felt an overwhelming relief wash over his chest. He survived. It was then that something unexpected happened. The little bear, still weak, still fragile, moved slightly, and for an instant, his gaze met Nolan. It was a brief moment, but full of meaning. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was something different. It was as if he somehow understood what had happened. As if, for a brief second, there was a connection between two completely different species, united in that instant by something greater than logic could explain. He felt a lump in his throat. He had never experienced anything like this before. He had never seen an animal look at him like that, with that silent intensity, as if recognizing that his life had been saved by that person. And there, in that moment, a simple yet powerful truth filled his mind. I never thought a simple gesture could mean so much. The little bear closed his eyes again, but this time, not out of weakness. It was different. He wasn't fainting. He wasn't succumbing to the cold. He just rested. For the first time in a long time, his body wasn't desperately fighting against imminent death. For the first time, he was in a safe place. He let out a long sigh, feeling the tension finally dissolve a little from his shoulders. But he knew that the fight was not over yet. That was just the first step. The cub had survived the coldest night of his life, but what would come next? Would he be able to regain his strength? Would he be strong enough to return to the wild? Or was this fragile connection forming between them about to change everything? And you, what do you think will happen now? This little bear still has a long way to go, and I guarantee that this story is far from over. Tell me here in the comments, have you ever witnessed something this exciting? Have you ever seen a wild animal fighting for its life in such an intense way? I want to know your opinion. And if you want to find out what happens next, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell right now. The next chapter of this story will surprise you. The first light of morning filtered through the cracks in the cabin, casting a golden glow on the rustic wood and spreading a soft warmth throughout the room. The wind from the night before had died down, and the silence outside indicated that the storm had finally passed. But inside the cabin, a new chapter of this story was about to unfold. Nolan, he was sitting by the fireplace holding a mug of cold coffee, not daring to take his eyes off the little creature curled up on the hay and blankets. The bear cub was breathing deeply, in a different way than the night before. His chest rose and fell in a rhythmic, constant manner, without the uncontrolled tremors that previously dominated his body. The ambient heat had done its work. For a long time, Nolan, he remained there, just observing, not knowing exactly what to expect. He had spent the night awake, listening to every sound, attentive to every movement. The little bear had fought against the cold, against hunger, against destiny itself, and now, against all odds, he was still alive. It was then that something happened. A small movement, subtle but full of meaning. The puppy's paws stretched slightly, his muscles contracting in a natural reflex of someone waking up from a deep sleep. A soft sigh escaped his parched snout. And then, the eyes opened. Nolan. He leaned forward a little, not wanting to scare him. The cub blinked a few times, as if trying to understand where he was, as if his mind was still caught between survival instinct and the unexpected comfort he had been exposed to. He was no longer in the snow, I was no longer alone. For a few seconds he remained there, motionless, just breathing, absorbing the moment. And then something happened that Nolan I would never forget. With a slow and still somewhat hesitant movement, the little bear raised its head and looked straight at him. There was no fear in that look. There was no panic, no distrust. There was something different, something that Nolan I couldn't explain it in words. It was a look of recognition, and at that moment, without warning, the cub did something unexpected. He moved closer, still a little wobbly, and extended his snout toward his arm. Nolan. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but the impact was profound, a simple gesture filled with an indescribable emotion. Nolan, he felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't a food order. It wasn't an attempt to escape. It was something much purer than that. It was gratitude. For a moment, time seemed to stop inside that cabin. The connection between man and animal manifested itself at its most instinctive and deepest level. There were no words, no promises, just a silent understanding that for a brief moment, their paths had crossed in a way that could never be forgotten. The little bear then backed away slightly, and to his surprise, Nolan tried to get up. It was difficult at first. Its paws were still weak, its movements not completely steady, but he insisted. He wanted to walk. Nolan observed without interfering. He knew this moment was important. It was proof that the cub still had a chance, that he had not lost the strength necessary to continue his journey. After a few minutes, the cub finally managed to gain a foothold. He looked around the cabin, sniffed the air, tried to make sense of this new world to which he had been temporarily introduced. Nolan. He almost smiled when he saw him exploring the space with curiosity, touching some objects with his paw, bumping into small things, testing his own skills again. But then, reality hit. Nolan. I knew I couldn't keep him there. He didn't belong there. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't a companion who could stay by your side. That bear belonged in the forest, and now it was time to let him go. With a deep sigh, Nolan. He got up and walked to the door. He hesitated for a moment, but then, with a determined movement, he opened it slowly. The cold air rushed in immediately, but this time it didn't feel as cruel as the night before. The day was brighter, and the snow glistened in the weak sun that was beginning to appear on the horizon. The cub felt the change in the environment, He turned to the open door, sniffing the wind, feeling the natural calling that had always been inside him. It was his home. Nolan took a step back, allowing the little bear to make his own decision. And that's what he did. Slowly, with still hesitant steps, but now more confident, he walked towards the exit. The heat of the cabin left him behind, but he didn't hesitate. He knew he needed to move on. But then, just as I was about to completely cross the threshold, he stopped. He turned his head one last time and looked at Nolan. One last look, one last moment, and then he is gone. His small body disappeared between the trees, his silhouette becoming just a shadow in the white immensity of the forest. With every step he took, the distance between him and the hut increased. Nolan. He stood there for a long time, watching, saying nothing. His heart was heavy, but at the same time he felt a strange peace. He knew he would never see that cub again, but I also knew I had done the right thing. Life always finds a way, and sometimes a simple act of compassion can change everything. Now tell me, what did you feel while following this story? Do you believe that animals can feel gratitude the same way we do? Have you ever experienced something similar? Leave your comment below. I really want to know your opinion. And if you want more exciting stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what happened here today may have been an ending. But in the wild, every end is just the beginning of a new journey. The snow had begun to melt, revealing dark patches of damp earth between the trees. Alaska's harsh winter was giving way to a slow, halting spring, but it was still a relief to see the once barren landscape begin to gain signs of life again. The sky, previously covered by dense and heavy clouds, now let small beams of sun pass through, slightly warming the freezing air. Nolan. He had become accustomed to these subtle changes, to the rhythms of nature around him, and he liked to follow each transformation as he spent his mornings sitting on the porch of his cabin, with a cup of hot coffee in his hands and his eyes wandering around the forest that surrounded him. It had been 3 months since that unforgettable night. 3 months since he had opened the door to a dying little bear cub. 3 months since he had held that fragile body in his arms, feeling the heat escape from his trembling paws. 3 months since she had witnessed that moment of pure connection, of silent gratitude, before seeing him leave for his true home. Since then, Nolan. He often wondered if that cub had managed to survive, if he had found his mother, if he was strong enough to face the challenges of the forest. Deep down, he knew he would never get an answer. Nature was like that, unpredictable, untamed. He just hoped he gave him a chance. That morning, as he leaned back on the weathered wooden chair on the porch, taking in the fresh scent of the damp forest, Nolan felt something different. A weight in the air, a silence that was unusual. So he listened. The distinct sound of heavy footsteps, slow, rhythmic, coming from the edge of the forest. He frowned, his body automatically becoming more alert. His time in that cabin had taught him to recognize the sounds of the forest. He knew when it was the wind blowing the branches, when it was an elk crossing the snow, when it was small predators sniffing tracks. But this sound was different. The footsteps got even closer, and then something climbed the steps of his porch. Nolan. He set his coffee cup aside, slowly standing up. His heart started to race. He knew that sound. Heavy, strong, but still familiar. He held the door handle for a moment, took a deep breath, and then, with a firm movement, opened it. And there he was. The cub had returned. Nolan, he froze for a moment, unable to fully process what he was seeing. But he was no longer the same. The small, fragile creature he had held in his arms that cold night was now bigger, stronger. His fur, once matted and hardened by frost, was now thick and shiny. His eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now held a wild, determined gleam. He had survived. He had won. Nolan. He felt his heart tighten in his chest. He never expected to see him again. He never imagined that after so long he would return to that place. But then he realized something. The cub was not alone. By your side, an adult bear stood imposingly, observing everything with attentive eyes. Nolan held his breath. He knew exactly what that meant. His mother. He found her. That scene seemed almost surreal. For months, he had wondered what had happened to the little bear after that night. Now, he had his answer. Not only did he survive, he found his way back to his family. The mother bear observed everything with a calm but vigilant look. She knew this was human territory. Any other wild animal would have moved away long ago, but she was there. And not by chance. Then something happened that I would never forget. The young bear, now strong and imposing, took a small step forward and made the same gesture he had made months ago when he was weak and defenseless inside the cabin. He touched her arm with the snout. For a moment, it was as if time had gone back, as if that little puppy that almost froze to death was still there, in that silent touch. But now, he wasn't begging for help. He was saying, "Thank you, Nolan." He swallowed hard, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. This was real. The bear then slowly walked away, stopping next to its mother. They exchanged one last look, and then, without hesitation, the bear turned and began walking back into the forest, her son following close behind. He stood there, watching them disappear into the trees. He knew this was the last time he would see them. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was back. And now, finally, he was where he always belonged. Now tell me, do you believe that animals can feel gratitude? After everything that happened, after this unbelievable reunion, it is impossible to deny that there is something much bigger than we can understand. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt this connection with a wild animal? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know your opinion. And if you want more exciting stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now and activate the bell. Because if this story moved you, wait until you see what we have next. Nature always surprises us, and you won't want to miss what comes next. When he remained motionless on the porch, his eyes fixed on the forest as the silhouette of the bears disappeared between the trees. The wind swayed the branches, carrying the soft echo of heavy footsteps on the snow, until complete silence fell. They are gone. But the feeling that remained was not one of loss. It was something much bigger, something he would never forget. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and only then did he realize the weight of that moment. That puppy, who 3 months ago was on the verge of death, had come back stronger, more prepared, with a new chance that he might not have had if it weren't for that small gesture. And now, he was on his way alongside his mother, free, exactly as he should be. For a long time, he believed that nature followed its own course, that it was not up to humans to interfere. But that night had changed something inside him. There were rules in the jungle, yes, but there was something bigger than any rule: compassion. Because in the end, what does it mean to be human if not the ability to feel, understand, and help? Nature doesn't ask us for anything. But when we have the opportunity to make a difference, the choice is in our hands. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the little bear's touch on his arm. That simple gesture, but full of meaning. She remembered his eyes, once dimmed by cold and hunger, and then full of life and strength. He remembered the moment he decided to open the door and change the fate of that defenseless creature. And it was then that he understood. Nature teaches us that compassion has no limits. When we help a living being, we are not just saving another life, we are saving ourselves. Dolan, he turned and entered the cabin, feeling the heat of the fire still present in the fireplace. But somehow something inside him was even warmer. He picked up his mug of coffee, now cold, and smiled slightly. Some stories are not just stories. They are reminders. Reminders that every small action matters, that a simple choice can change a destiny. Now, I ask you, how many lives can we transform if each of us makes a small gesture? Think about it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt this deep connection with an animal? Have you ever witnessed a moment where a simple act made all the difference? I really want to know your story. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because here we always bring real stories that prove the power of empathy. The next video could be even more exciting than this one. And I guarantee you won't want to miss it. This little bear's story may have come to an end, but the lessons she left us still resonate. What would have happened if Nolan had ignored that silent cry for help? If he had closed the door and turned his back, believing it was not his place to interfere? Maybe that cub would never have survived. Maybe he would never have found his mother again. Never would have grown strong enough to face the challenges of the forest. And now I ask you, what if each of us could make a difference in the same way? We often think that small gestures don't change anything, that a single action is not enough. But this story proves us otherwise. The impact of a simple act of compassion can echo throughout a lifetime. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you do instead, Nolan? Would you have opened that door? Would you have risked helping? Or would you have let nature take its course without interference? Tell me in the comments. I want to know your opinion. And more than that, have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever helped an animal in distress? Have you ever witnessed a moment of connection as profound as this? Share your story here. I read every comment and love knowing what you think. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Send it to that friend who loves animals, to that person who believes that every life matters. Let's spread this message, because the more people who hear it, the more likely we are to inspire others to make a difference. And if you want to see more exciting stories like this, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Here, in each video, we bring real stories, full of emotion, connection, and unforgettable lessons about wildlife and the impact we can have on it. And look, if this story has already moved you, wait until you see what we have in the next videos. The animal world is full of unexpected moments, challenges, reunions, and goodbyes. And each of these stories has something incredible to teach us. Then, don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Click the subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and come be part of this community passionate about real and transformative stories. Why not end? It's not just animals that change when they receive help. We are the ones who change along with them. See you in the next video.